Everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the Good Systems Speaker Series. We appreciate you taking time to join us this afternoon and we have a great program lined up for you. I'm Stacy Cayley. I'm the Network Relationship Manager for Good Systems, which is the Ethical AI Research Grand Challenge here at the University of Texas at Austin. And we host this speaker series to bring together diverse, interdisciplinary, and cross-sector perspectives to advance ethical AI. We're excited to have Dr. Claire Wardle from Brown University here with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our host for the day, Dr. Matt Leese, who is a professor in the School of Information and a member of the Good Systems executive team, co-leading our Designing Responsible AI to Curb Disinformation research project. Dr. Leese, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Stacy. Well, I'm thrilled to have Claire joining us today. As I was mentioning before the call started, Claire actually was here at UT in person last year to accept a meritorious award, as well as to speak at our Connections conference in person. So we're glad she could come back to join us virtually now for this year. So yeah, as Stacey was introducing, my name is Matt Leese, Professor of School of Information. I lead our Good Systems project around curbing disinformation. And so it's very apt and we're thrilled to have Claire with us speaking today. So just a quick bio. Claire Wardle is co-founder and co-director of the Information Futures Lab and professor of practice at the Brown School of Public Health. She is considered a leader in the field of misinformation, verification, and user-generated content, having co-authored the foundational report, Information Disorder, an interdisciplinary framework for research and policy for the Council of Europe. In 2015, Wardle co-founded the nonprofit First Draft, a pioneer in innovation, research, and practice in the field of misinformation. Over the past decade, she has developed an organization-wide training program for the BBC on eyewitness media, verification, and misinformation, led social policy at the UNHCR, been a fellow at the Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, and served as research director for the Toe Center of Digital Journalism at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. She holds a PhD in communications from the University of Pennsylvania. And I appreciate her shortening her bio because if I said everything, we would just keep going for the rest of this call today. We want to make sure we have time for her to speak. I'm also thrilled that she's coming from Brown since I did my own PhD there. And so delighted to hear about what she has to tell us about her work today. So Claire will be talking, her title is, What Can the Participatory Disinformation Ecosystem Teach Us About How AI Will Be Recognized? So Claire, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk with all of you today. I wish we were just at a round table having a conversation. One of my big themes from this talk is that many of us live in an information environment that's still pretty top-down, linear, and hierarchical. The person with the most letters after the name tends to be the person at the podium, and the idea is that our communication is quite passive. When actually, if we spend time in participatory information ecosystems, people really feel like they're part of something, they feel heard, they feel like they have a sense of agency, they're told to do their own research. So I think a lot about that, even when I'm in my classroom, how do I set up the design of the classroom to make sure that it's not top down? So I am going to talk for 40 minutes, that was the plan, but I really hope that you have questions and that we can have some kind of participatory element, because that really is the big lesson that I want you to take away from this. So I've got some slides. The good thing about this world is that it's very visual when it comes to disinformation. So there's stuff for us to look at. And I know many of you are real experts in artificial intelligence, and I'll be clear, I'm not a computer scientist. I am somebody who thinks deeply around information ecosystems. I'm a qualitative researcher, but I hope that I can share some of my learnings from studying information environments for the last 20 years and really apply that to the moment that we're in. Because I think one of my frustrations is that we're considering artificial intelligence as this brand new threat, and we're simply not learning the lessons from the internet revolution and social media. So my point here is, how can we really learn those lessons? So if we get going, I'm a co-founder of this lab, Information Futures Lab, where we really try and connect research, policy, and practice. Because again, a lot of the study in this space is in its own silos. And for me, it's really about how do we bridge those gaps. And for a long time, even though I have a PhD, I co-founded a nonprofit called First Draft, and we worked closely with community groups, newsrooms, UN agencies, and others to help them think through the challenges of misinformation. So whilst I am now at Brown, a lot of my career has been at the BBC, at the UN, in different spaces, really learning from those practitioners who they would say, oh, we're just throwing spaghetti at the wall, but they really were doing research every day. They just didn't necessarily think about it in that way. So from today's talk, I want to start with some definitions and foundational concepts. Then I want to think a little bit more deeply about this participatory information ecosystem, then think about current and future threats, which you all know, but I think it's worth considering together. And then let's end with hopefully some happier notes. But the argument, as you just heard me say, is that we need to look at the ways that social media has already been weaponized by disinformation actors to prepare for the ways that AI will supercharge those vulnerabilities. So there is so much that we can learn from right now that we can apply, and that, I think, is the key. So in terms of definitions and foundational concepts, AI, right? Like the very foundational concept of this talk. As I say, artificial intelligence, all of you on the talk are thinking about different elements of this. Right now, there's an obsession with generative AI, but of course, AI didn't emerge November 2022. Like we've had a whole host of other types of AI. And this was a tweet from Daphne Keller the other day in reaction to a talk that was taking place at Yale. But she said, it's tragic how much Gen AI has taken focus away from AI that affects medical care, prison sentences, ability to get loans, and so many other parts of people's lives, especially poor and marginalized people's lives. And so whilst I think there's an obsession now about the ways that generative AI can be weaponized by bad actors, I want to think about weaponization and harm as it applies in other sectors. And who's the bad actor, right? So we have this sense of the bad actor is the Russian troll or the teenager in his bedroom, without necessarily thinking about the harm through the weaponization of AI by organizations that weren't necessarily deliberately trying to cause harm, but the systems that they're building are causing that harm. So, of course, we know this, AI used to predict arrests and other types of aspects of policing. No surprising, the evaluations show that really they are not as good at predicting crimes as we had thought, and they disproportionately harm people of color and marginalized communities. I think we could have guessed that in 2018, but that is what we're seeing in terms of how it's being rolled out by police departments. We know things like Uber and Lyft pricing algorithms charge more in non-white areas. We know that because fewer cars drive around in those areas. So when somebody asks to be picked up, the driver has to come from further away. So that wasn't built into the algorithm, but that has been what happened when drivers are using algorithmically powered technology. AI bias caused 80% of Black mortgage applicants to be denied. Again, if you look at these articles, these are all from 2, 3, 4 years ago, right? Like this isn't new findings. We have known for a while the way that AI was already widening divisions and causing additional harm to communities that were already being harmed. And this is actually from a friend of mine, Hilke Schellman, who's written this great new book about the ways that algorithms are dictating who's being hired, how they're being monitored, and how they're being fired. And what I find fascinating is I often hear people say, you know what, I've sent out 200 CVs. I just don't understand why I'm not getting picked, because they don't have any understanding of how ZipRecruiter and other types of AI systems are being used for hiring practices. So much of this is around awareness, right? Like we know why these algorithms have this bias inherent in them. You know, that's part of what we're going to talk about in this presentation. But the challenge here is like a lack of awareness from people themselves who are part of communities who are being harmed. If we hear conversations about the executive order on AI or other multi-stakeholder meetings, I'm often like, oh, where's the community leader around that table? They're not there. They're not part of these discussions as we think about the next generation of artificial intelligence. Where are those voices? People who can't access information in English, can only access it on a data plan. They don't have that much data, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the challenges in the conversations around AI is that you just constantly feel like you're on this like seesaw or whiplash, because it's a mixture of like, yes, AI is going to do everything for you magically, and like AI is going to kill us all. And that isn't creating a space where we can have the necessary conversations around harms and what do we do about it. And this was just from last week, Kevin Roose from the New York Times talking about his new favorite AI-powered search engine that was going to replace Google. But at the same time, AI is poised to wreck the 2024 election. Like this is just a classic kind of selection of ways in which we're thinking about AI. And so much of this, right, I could maybe not the left side, but the conversations about AI is poised to wreck the 2024 election, I could have just insert social media there. Social media is poised to wreck the 2016 election. It's poised to wreck the 2020 election, right? So what I'm trying to get us to understand is, how do we think about not only the lessons from earlier days of AI, and I'm aware when I say, you know, the kind of conversations I just linked to of the last 5 years, there's a much, much, much longer history around AI. But since AI has been in the kind of space where the New York Times would write about it, there's so much that we can learn from the ways that we did or didn't think about harms in the social media context. So for me, I reiterate, we need to think about all of the ways that different uses of AI can and will be, be weaponized to cause harm, including intentional and unintentional, right? Uber and Lyft didn't go to create an app that was going to cause people in marginalized communities to pay more, or a Department of Health that's creating a symptom checker isn't designing that to cause harm, but it is unintentionally causing harm. So when we think about weaponization, we think about harm, also let's think about actors. They might not be doing this intentionally, but they are themselves causing harm. So I've been studying what I call information disorder for over 20 years now, with a real focus over the last 10 years. But I just want to share some of those lessons and think about how they might apply to AI. The first one, neat definitions and categories rarely map onto the complexity of the information ecosystem. So in 2017, I wrote this report called Information Disorder, and I created this Venn diagram when I was talking about falsity and intention to do harm. And it has been used in many slide decks, not just mine. And people liked it because it was a nice, neat description of what seemed to be really complex and messy. But in my own work, I've now really come to rethink that Venn diagram to say, and this is a piece I wrote last March, and I actually put my hand up and said, I wish I hadn't created this Venn diagram. And I actually think that this overly simple, tidy framework is no longer useful, right? Because I think by creating what was neat and allowing people to be like, but is this false or true? Did the person intend to cause harm or not? That is very hard to do in the real world. And this is somebody who actually appears in many of my slide decks. And maybe one day I will meet her and say, I'm sorry that I've used you in so many slide decks, but I find you so important. And that's because this person I found in an anti-vax community on Instagram in 2019. And as you can see, she believes that she is informed, and she is holding a binder full of documentation. And by following her, I realized a lot of this was from academic and medical journals. And so when I looked at this person, I thought, well, where does she sit in my Venn diagram? Like, she's not the classic disinformation agent, the disinformation agent being the person who is deliberately creating false information to cause harm. She's not deliberately creating false information to cause harm, but she's also not a misinformation agent, who is the person who mistakenly shares something in the coffee shop because they haven't got time to check. I was like, this person really believes that she's preventing harm. She really believes that vaccines are causing harm. And she is part of a community where she feels like she is doing something. I was like, okay. And from that moment on, I just realized that the simplistic ways that I felt like my field was thinking about the information ecosystem was completely failing to capture somebody like this person. And I'll get onto another group of people who also made me think deeply about this. Secondly, our brains rely heavily on heuristics and existing worldviews, right? So, of course, this is, I could have pulled out many of these. This was from Ron DeSantis's War Room. If you think that Fauci is a terrible person and you don't particularly support Trump, this just does everything that it needs to do, right? Like, what's the point of going to fact check that? It already supports your worldview. And almost all effective disinformation does exactly this. It has an audience in mind, it taps into their worldviews, and it relies on selective bias and others to make sure, motivational reasoning, that people don't question it. Turns out things like imposter content are really, really effective, right? If I'm standing in that coffee shop and I'm scrolling quickly, I haven't got time to check everything. So I rely on these heuristics. A news brand that I trust is going to make me much more likely to believe something, and I'm much less likely to check. And you probably know this too, but when you put people in labs, they're really good at figuring out what's true and false. Really good. They're terrible in the real world. Right? Because we're overwhelmed, and so we end up relying on heuristics, et cetera, et cetera. This is another favorite actually from 2016. This is two genuine images juxtaposed. This is from Maricopa County. This is people really standing in line for the primary, and this really is somebody being arrested by ICE. And if you believe that illegal immigrants are voting, why are you even going to stop any further? You just press share because it does exactly what you want it to do. But if you slow down for 2 seconds, like there's no way these people would still be looking at their phones if somebody was being arrested. Like you just 2 seconds of looking, you just know that this doesn't capture, people would be looking at the person being arrested. But why are you going to do even that level of check, let alone a Google reverse image search? There are limited options for regulating or moderating content, but more when the focus is on the actors and their behaviors. So this is another oldie but favorite, although it's from a terrorist incident in London, but it does a really good job of really explaining the challenges of computational moderation and regulation around speech. So this is a genuine image of a woman who had just seen a terrorist incident on Westminster Bridge. And she is walking home and she's on the phone to her partner. And afterwards, she was interviewed and she said, this was one of the worst days of my life. I wasn't looking down at the victim out of respect. And also I was shaking. It'd been such a terrible incident. And I was on the phone to my loved one. This is a genuine image, but was taken and the context was weaponized. And this was an excuse to push out an Islamophobic post that was actually, it got shared very widely in the UK. And so when people complain to Twitter, so well, there's nothing we can do about this, right? It doesn't break our hate speech policies. There's nothing we can do about content. But 3 weeks later, they found out that Texas Lone Star was not from Texas, but was actually a Russian bot. And so 3 weeks later, they were able to take this content down, not because of the content, but because of the actor and their behavior, right? So one of our big lessons from social media is understanding the need to disconnect actors from behaviors with content, and there's very little we can do about content unless it's the worst of the worst, but there are things we can do around actors and behaviors. 4, we need to understand, disinformation actors, but increasingly the need to understand the misinformation super spreaders, right? So a lot of people in my field have become obsessed with foreign influence campaigns, understanding bot networks, thinking about malign influence. But I actually really like the work of researchers who look at, okay, there are a relatively small number of disinformation agents. The bigger problem is how it spreads, which gets to our participatory conversation here. And there's this researcher called Neil Johnson, who is a physicist, interestingly, but he does amazing network maps. And he's actually shown through a huge data set from Facebook how parenting communities end up being at the start of almost any conspiracy theory or misinformation. Partly because he also says dog owners, my dog is there, but I don't do that. Dogs and parents groups, they tend to be really worried about things, whether it's going to harm their dog or harm their child. So they end up constantly doing their own research and then sharing it with their communities. So for me, it's so fascinating of how do we understand those communities, going back to the woman who had informed on her T-shirt. How do we understand her? How do we understand the way these communities work? How do we understand how that participatory dynamic creates so much velocity around this content, rather than, oh my goodness, we just need to play whack-a-mole with the disinformation agents. And if you haven't read this is an also great piece by Neil and colleagues called The Rise of the Post-Pandemic Resilience Across the Distrust Ecosystem. Because what I love about your Good Systems network is that it's multidisciplinary. But the problem with a lot of studies around this is that we sit in our disciplinary silos, right? So I sit in a school of public health. So people go, oh, so you just study health misinformation. And then people in political science ones like, oh, you do electoral disinformation. And then people in environmental, oh, you do climate disinformation. Well, those who actually post this content, they are super connected, because if they don't trust that climate change is real, they also don't trust election systems, and they don't believe that COVID is real. So how do we understand the networked effect of this distrust ecosystem, rather than thinking in silos, like topic by topic, because that is not how the other side, for want of a better word, works. So misinformation sharing is powered by participatory dynamics, both online and off. You keep hearing me say this, but this is a nice, simple piece that came out in the Harvard Misinformation Review about an offline newspaper called The Light in the UK. And they did a content analysis of The Light. So this was printed, sent out to people. And it was a real driver of particularly COVID conspiracy content during the election. But in their paper, what I like so much is that they really talk about articles and the like do not treat readers as passive recipients of information, but adopt a number of devices aimed at directly engaging them in conspiracy theories. For instance, articles frequently attempt to distinguish between a passive majority and those awake readers who understand the sinister true motives behind public policy measures aimed at addressing the pandemic. So when we're thinking about all of this, it's about psychology. It's about people feeling a sense of belonging, people feeling a sense that they're the hero in their own story, that if they find all the clues to the puzzle, they will have the answer. All of this is about psychology of what it means to feel part of something. And in an era where loneliness becomes an increasingly important public policy issue, we have to connect the dots between loneliness and what these disinformation ecosystems provide people, which is absolutely a sense of being heard and a sense of agency that you can do something. And they follow on by saying, our findings also echo recent work suggesting contemporary forms of conspiracy theory can be participatory, with those involved not simply passive receptors of inaccurate or misleading information, but involved in a process of research and discovery, becoming actively involved in the conspiracy theory itself, which goes back to our friend with the binder. She is actively looking at the New England Journal of Medicine, trying to find the segment that reinforces her worldview that vaccines are dangerous, right? So that feeling of people being part of something. So I'm giving you all of this as learnings from social media, but how can we think about how the exact same dynamics will be used to weaponize particularly generative AI systems? So when we move on to section 2, participatory information ecosystems, most of you here of a certain age will know that the internet is mostly visual, that some of us come from an age where we love text and we love PDF, but actually the internet has taken a very strong visual turn, which is why TikTok and Instagram are so popular, and YouTube. And when I do any kind of training with departments of health or UN agencies and they're putting out these 95-page PDFs, I'm just saying that's why you're losing. I'm not saying you need to create more memes, but we have to think in ways that are more visual, which is why the generative AI thing is such a concern. This is from 2017. This is the French election. And this is actually a Dropbox folder where young teenagers in France were creating anti-establishment memes and sharing them in Dropbox. And this was 2017. Like, we have collaborative, we have Google Drive, we have Dropbox, this is before generative AI, the ability to use Paint to create memes, right? So we've got all of this behavior and learning. Now we just have the most insanely powerful tools to do it more quickly and to be more influential. But at the same time, inauthentic in the sense it's like messy and ugly, can be just as powerful, right? So also thinking about, it's not always the polished generative AI that's going to work. We've also got to be, this isn't going to go away, this stuff either. And so this is from a friend of mine, Joan Donovan, who wrote this recently, talking about January 6th. So I showed you the woman with the binder. The other people who I think deeply about who don't fit into my Venn diagram are those people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. They felt they were defending democracy. They thought they were protecting the Constitution. They didn't fit into my deliberately creating and sharing false information circle. And they also didn't fit into the mistakenly sharing information without checking. They were in an alternate information reality where they believed that they were heroes who were protecting democracy. Like that is a very different way of thinking about the information ecosystem than the deficit model of, oh, people need more facts. But Joan talks here about how January 6th was an example of networked incitement, right? And those of you who have, deep historical knowledge of the internet, it was designed to be networked. And I think when I reflect back from particularly like 1999 to 2008, there was a lot of really exciting pilots and projects that really used the networked capability of social media and the internet. 2008, 2009 came along, and editors and managers got on social media and were like, oh, well, can't we just tell people to tune in at 11 on Twitter? Can't we just tell people to read our articles? And so then we sort of took this turn where everybody did have a Facebook or Twitter account, but they were still broadcasting on it. And the disinformation agents took the participatory networked characteristics of the internet and used them to their advantage. So the whole point is, if we're going to balance the scales, our information environment needs to be participatory. We need people to feel heard and to feel like they're part of something. Because if you go back and look at some of the Stop the Steal content, you can see this. This was from Eric Trump just after the election saying, help stop voter suppression, irregularities and fraud. Tell us what you're seeing. It's all about create content, tell us, be part of something, do your own research. So that participatory element is what's so critical. So when we think about current and future threats, we need to take everything we learn from the ways social media has and is causing harm and think about the ways AI will exacerbate it. So, of course, last week we had, we had lots of Taylor Swift stories. We had Taylor Swift as a PSYOPs operation, but we also had the graphic imagery of Taylor Swift that ended up being on X for a while and had over 45 million views. Obviously terrible. I'm very sorry for Taylor Swift. This should not happen to her. But actually, we keep getting this wrong, is that we're obsessed with celebrity deepfakes, and that's the story that people want to tell. When actually, this is about ordinary women having their faces and bodies taken from social media and then put into deepfake content, porn. And I think that, to me, when we think about the participatory element of this, for the last 5 years, there's been like, oh my goodness, deepfakes. What happens if somebody creates a deepfake Trump or Biden? That's been the story, when actually here, thousands and thousands of women have had their lives upended. 95% of deepfakes were pornography. We just didn't talk about it. And if you haven't seen, this film that just came out last fall called Another Body, it's about a college student who had this happen to her. And what's amazing about the film is that her whole face is deep faked for the whole documentary because she doesn't want her face to be in the documentary. But it's about her journey to figure out what happened to her. And there's a scene in the film that I decided not to show because it's kind of gross, but she has to go and do her own search on 4chan to find mentions of her where all of these men are basically saying, oh, can you take her face and get her to do that? Can you get her body to get her it's the participatory community, but it's around porn on 4chan of people teaching each other how to create deep fakes and how to do this. It's like all the best bits of participation, but in this terrible context of pornography. This is also a really excellent database, which I wanted to showcase, but it's really about, we do have to worry about politicians. And in Slovenia, we just recently had an incident where a deep fake, it does look like it might have impacted the election. So I'm not saying we should only be concerned about pornography, but that is the number one thing we should be concerned about. But we should also be concerned about elections. But if you haven't looked at this database, it's called an incident database, and it goes through all the different ways that we have deep fakes and other generative AI that have caused kind of societal harm. But I kind of want to do an and/or here, right? So yes, in Slovakia, I think it's in Slovenia. In Slovakia, we had this problem. It's a real concern. It was an AI-generated fake audio of verbal abuse. But in 2018, I was working on the Brazilian election, which you might not remember, but Bolsonaro, who was at the time the front runner, was knifed when he was out doing a campaign, and he ended up in hospital. Well, from his hospital bed, people started getting WhatsApp messages of an audio message of Bolsonaro. And so I was working with a team of journalists and fact checkers, and we were like, is this true? It doesn't seem to be true, but how are we going to fact check it? We had to work with some forensic audio specialists that took 3 days to create this graph for us, showing us that the way he rolled his R's wasn't the same as the way that the person rolled their R's on that message. But that wasn't generative AI. That was just a Bolsonaro impersonator. So again, when we think about this, yes, we have to worry about generative AI, but we also have to think about, well, what's happening here? Well, if our heuristics mean that we are much more likely to believe what this fake Bolsonaro was saying, it really makes little difference whether it's an impersonator or it's deep fake. So I also want us to keep grounding these conversations in the reality of what is another threat, which is a cheap fake. A couple of weeks ago, we had the New Hampshire primary, and you might have read that there was AI robocalls mimicking Biden. So we do have to worry about that. And I am concerned about the role of robocalls locally. I think we're going to have hyper-targeted local voter suppression campaigns. But also the bigger concern actually is deep fakes are coming for your bank balance. The other day I had a thing that said Bank of America on my phone. It wasn't Bank of America. I think it was generative AI, but we have real concerns coming out of South Korea of how many blackmail calls people are getting from their so-called mother or sister saying, I'm hurt, can you send money? And they're not. So yes, robocalls, but also let's think about how this is going to harm real people and communities. Instagram, the worst, as social media slammed as a gateway for child abuse. This is from March 2019. US law enforcement braces for flood of child sex abuse images generated by AI. So yes, of course, really deep concerns about how AI is going to impact that, but also understanding that the platforms still haven't got a handle on just ordinary child sexual abuse imagery, right? So something for us to be concerned about. And then whether or not we could have a much conversation about whether or not Cambridge Analytica really did manage to change election results, who knows? But when we think about the history of that, there's a lot to learn about what was promised with the likes of Cambridge Analytica saying that they could take societies and widen those divisions. I'm glad to see that Meta is barring political advertising from using generative AI ad tools, but I think we should be going much further when we have so little to know about how generative AI could work, because this is a really excellent piece. I might share some of these links afterwards. This was a Channel 4 News article that went back to Milwaukee in 2016 and showed how the Trump campaign used voter records to basically lump everybody into different categories. And for those that they said were disengaged, they had an active voter suppression campaign on just those people they had targeted using Facebook and using voter rolls because they had come up with that. And I watched this again this weekend and I was like, oh my God, this plus AI, right? So again, just on all the examples of when people are saying what might happen with AI, we already have uses before AI that should act as a kind of like a pathway for us and should act as a kind of, we can do red teaming exercises around it. But of course, there are some new concerns, and I think you know these, like the liar's dividend. We didn't have the liar's dividend with just social media. The liar's dividend being the idea that if I'm a politician who lies and I get caught lying, I can now say, oh, wasn't me, it was a deep fake, right? So AI has created these new concerns, the liar's dividend being a major one. Even poor Harry Styles got caught out. Harry Styles and the liar's dividend. The advent of AI deepfakes means we'll waste endless hours arguing about what's real. Like that is not nothing. And in fact, I pulled this out from my archives. This is from 2017. Somebody tweeted, the biggest casualty to AI won't be jobs, but the final and complete eradication of trust in anything you see or hear. So somebody tweeted that in December 2017, and we've already started to see this in the Middle East when if people see really graphic content, you hear them say, oh, that can't be true. That must be a deep fake. That must be AI, right? So in 6 years, we're already getting to a moment where even though photography and videography always used to be the evidence that we would trust for war crimes, investigations, and other things, the fact that we're already starting to hear people say, I don't trust that, even though it looks like a photograph, they're the harms that I want to really start, concerning ourselves with. And whilst this isn't quite the same, I think what we're already seeing is people turning away from sources of information that doesn't really make them feel good. And so we live in a pretty scary world right now. And so we're seeing the news avoidance becoming a real thing. So you add news avoidance to people saying, I can't trust anything. What's the point? And I worry that we're going to have a kind of a society that really has become completely disengaged. So that's not about the content of AI. That's about what it's doing to society and how society is reacting to such a revolutionary technology. Which goes to, how does the media cover it? Because the media has two ways of covering it. Well, it has multiple, actually. By catastrophizing AI, we're going to cause more people to go to this. But by talking about the harms, being honest about the harms, talking about the need to bring communities into the conversations, then we're much more likely to allow this revolutionary technology to happen, but with safeguards, giving people a way to say, this is causing me harm, and other ways. That's how we should be seeing it. So just in conclusion, societies are more divided than ever along cultural, socioeconomic, geographic, ethnic, and religious lines. Agents of disinformation are taking advantage of this environment where people want to feel a sense of belonging with those that share their views. They will use AI when it makes it easier to achieve these goals, right? So we need to understand these underlying kind of forces to then say, well, how does AI fit into this? As opposed to, oh, AI is this new technology we should think about differently. This is the fundamental baseline we should be thinking about, and then say, well, when will AI be used to exacerbate that? And disinformation is about creating and establishing narratives. The focus is the cumulative impact over time. AI can supercharge this process, but also can help with the detection of narratives. But one of my frustrations about my field is that we tend to play whack-a-mole with individual pieces of content. Should we take down this YouTube video? Should we label this tweet? When we're really bad at looking at how narratives emerge over time. As a British person, we've had 20 years of terrible tabloid news headlines denigrating refugees and migrants, to the point now that my country is almost completely intolerant and in fact ships them to Rwanda. I mean, unbelievable to me. But understanding how that narrative has been this drip, 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 drip. And so that, to me, if we're thinking about AI, it's not about the one deep fake. It's about the creation of lots and lots of content that reinforces misogyny, anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and other types of ideas over time, when none of those individual pieces of content will get taken down by platforms, but over time are causing real harm. So we urgently need better tools for detecting content narratives and tactics, better tools for understanding online communities and mapping online communities. We need tools that people can use to help verify AI-generated content. I get asked all the time. I do a lot of presentations to like League of Women Voters and community groups, and they always go, how can we tell? And I'm like, look to see if the fingers are spindly. I mean, we have no, I mean, it's bonkers. I used to be able to give these whole verification training courses on how would you verify social media content. But when it comes to deep fakes, it's like, are the fingers spindly? No. And finally, we need ways to educate people that don't scare them, because we have ways through this. And I think there are ways that we can adapt. But right now, I worry that the conversation around AI is either too, oh my goodness, it's everything, or it's going to kill us. And that's not helping us as a society. So happy to take your questions and anything else that we can have as a participatory conversation. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Claire. Really nice talk. And yeah, sorry we, of course, can't be here in person to sort of be doing this all together. So I will invite folks to raise your hand in the Zoom feature, and if you can come on camera and ask your questions then. And I will just try to basically have questions in the answer there, or in the order that they're asked. And let me go ahead and just ask a question now, sort of to get started. So it was really interesting to hear you talk about how you've backed away from that beautiful Venn diagram that, yes, I confess to having used in a talk too in the past. So this issue of intent is really a tricky one, I think. So I had a invitation to address the Republican state legislature here at a caucus on disinformation. And, I gave this talk, and at the end they said, well, who is deciding what intent is? Like, who are you going to be sitting up there on high in your ivory tower and telling us, who's intent behind stuff? So what is the role, do you think, for us in thinking about intent, given that it's something that is a little tricky to suss out sometimes?
Yeah, and that's partly why I've backed away, for exactly that reason, is that it's so hard to investigate. I mean, I had a Washington Post reporter the other day, I was talking about something, she goes, oh, is that Russia? And I was like, you know what, I could go digging for 2 years, and it's increasingly hard to know who's behind it. And in that context, the intent is probably much, much clearer than the examples I was giving there about the woman with the binder or those from January 6th. So I think it has not helped us to think about either content or intent. And instead, we should be looking about things like behaviors. So like, is this a repeated behavior? Have they elsewhere talked about what they're trying to do? Because I think, and I'll just quickly talk to that, Matt. I mean, I'm currently being investigated by Jim Jordan. There is a moment where Republicans are saying, some of the actions that happened during the pandemic overstepped. And they're talking about content moderation being suppression or censorship, which I actually think is not correct. But at the same time, we need to have a conversation about, I think decisions were made during the pandemic that were not the best decisions. I think we did overcorrect or, over whatever the word is, but it was because we were all desperately trying to do the right thing. So going back to intention, yeah, I think some decisions were made that weren't good, but the intention was good. But then who's to decide all of that?
Yeah.
So I just think content and intent takes us down some really dangerous paths. And I think the more we can have conversations about like even mis and disinformation have become weaponized as terms. What do we mean by that? Do we, who decides whether something is false or misleading? The world is definitely round, but there's a ton of other science right now that we don't have scientific consensus over. And by labeling certain things misinformation, we're losing trust at a time where we absolutely can't. So I think intent is another thing. Who am I to say, the woman I talked about, I think she believes that vaccines are causing harm by everything else she's writing. But maybe she doesn't actually believe that. She's just making a ton of money as an Instagram influencer.
Right.
So is it behaviors or is it intent? So that's what I think we should be focusing much more on, behaviors than intent, because it's just so difficult.
Wonderful. Haley, you want to ask your question next? And then I'll read Mark's question after Haley, unless he wants to come on camera.
Awesome. Well, thank you first of all for the great talk. I'm one of the generative AI people, so I really appreciate you challenging me to think about other methods of information creation and dissemination. So, but yeah, what I was kind of thinking about was the deeper narrative of how people will get like in person in their communities and really share what they believe or trust. And like my dentist, I really like, you should check them out. And it was making me think about how a lot of young people nowadays will say, I don't even watch the news anymore. I trust TikTok more because it's a real life account. But then on the other hand, the recommendation algorithm is so rapid and siloed. And you get people saying, oh, I'm on this side of TikTok or this side of TikTok. You have such nuanced little groups of people. So do you have any, I was wondering about your general thoughts on how to navigate short form media and the information that spreads within those silos.
Yeah, well, firstly, I'd like to say, when you give a talk, you're always looking for someone in the audience that's smiling and nodding, and you did that the whole time. So I just want to say thank you to you for doing that. It was wonderful. And secondly, this is such a great question, because we know now from like the trust barometer that Edelman does every year, people are a lot less trusting of any of the major institutions. The only area where trust is going up is in people's co-workers and neighbors and community. So to your point, people are, in the absence of trusting the CDC, more likely to ask their friends and family whether or not they should get vaccinated. And to your point about TikTok, you're right about this idea of where does expertise come from? Like, we're all connected, most of us are connected to universities. So we have this idea that expertise comes from the number of years you've been at a university and how many letters you have after your name. But in many of the communities I study, expertise comes from lived experience, right? So a student of mine just did a research project about, on TikTok, RSV misinformation. And she found all of these mothers like cradling babies, crying, talking about their experience of RSV. Now, the way that we are wired as humans, having that parasocial relationship with that, TikTok is about people talking at you out of the phone, right? That's the whole design of TikTok. And we as humans are drawn to people lived experience. When I'm trying to buy something, I go into Amazon and look for people like, I bought this sofa and it made my bottom feel nice. Like the lived experience. Like, so we apply decisions that we're making around which holidays to buy or sofas to buy to, should I vaccinate my child? So to your point, we are now increasingly turning to people that we have these either social relationships with offline or on TikTok and others. We feel like we know, we're in a mother's group or whatever. So we've seen this mother go, and then all of a sudden the child gets RSV. You're going to do whatever that woman says, like, give your child honey. No, don't do that to a baby. Like, there's all this misinformation that actually is quite dangerous on TikTok, but it seems harmless and people are drawn to those people that we know. So I think the other part here around participation is you want to feel part of something, and that's something you trust deeply. And, even going back to some research about QAnon, people would say, yeah, I work night shifts, but every time I logged on, there was always somebody around the world that say, hello, how are you? Like that, you cannot put a price on that. And that having that connection with somebody means you're more likely to believe them when they start moving into something they don't really know anything about, but you've trusted them on what they ate for dinner and everything else that they've talked about that was safe. You then take the same thing when they talk about whether or not to get vaccinated.
Thank you, Claire. Mark, I don't think you're on. You want to come on, so I'm just going to go ahead and read your question. So Mark had asked, on top of disinformation created by, accelerated by AI, we also have a rapid decline in legitimate, trustworthy journalism. Can you talk about how these trends reinforce each other? I think there's also an interesting ambiguity in Mark's question. I think what he's talking about is, in sort of Web 2.0, anyone can publish anything. So there's a lot sort of democratized access, which means you don't necessarily get stuff from respectable channels. But there's also, a contingent that would claim that mainstream journalism is less reliable now, which I don't know, but, could be another way. How do you think about these trends?
Yeah, so thank you so much for asking this, Mark, because the decline of the news industry is just an utter tragedy. And the amount of places in the US where we have a news desert is a real problem. And when you do research with audiences, if somebody knows a journalist, they are much more trusting of journalism as an institution. But there are so many places where nobody knows a journalist because there isn't a journalist in wherever they live. And one of the worries as we go into this election, as we did in 2020, is the growth of pink slime websites. Now, they look like news websites, but they are often created by political operatives. But if I right now try to go to the Boston Globe, it would give me many, many pop-ups. It would give me a paywall and it would be ugly. If I go to something that sounds like the Boston Bugle, right? It looks like it loads really quickly. It has no ads, has no paywall. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to believe the Boston Bugle. So there is a real growth in alternative forms of information that are taking advantage of the decline in journalism. And, like I said, my biggest concern about 2024 is that we will have hyper-targeted local robocall campaigns powered by generative AI. If we do not have journalists in communities, or if we're not partnering with community groups, we won't know that those robocalls are happening. So I really, truly believe that one of the reasons we've had such growth in disinformation is, yes, partly platforms, but it's happened at the exact same time as we've had the collapse of the news industry and fewer well-resourced newsrooms where people got out into the community and talked to people and said, no, Bob, that's not true. Let me tell you about it. We just haven't had that in local community spaces. And so it's a real tragedy, and the two are connected as far as I think.
Wonderful. So I think the next question I see is, I'm sure it's Ashai. Do you want to ask your question yourself? I see your hand raised.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Achi. Thank you for your talk. It was really great. My main question is, you talked about how loneliness can often leave people susceptible to disinformation and misinformation. But, the way that technologies online are created is to sort of grab our attention and keep us in online spaces instead of out in the real world. So do you have any sort of suggestions for how we could design these social media spaces, or what we could be doing on almost like a public policy or local level to be having more cohesion within our communities instead of these lone wolves that are going online?
Well, I love this question too. Your questions are amazing, which is why participation matters so much. I got into all of this work in the early 2000s. I was working for the BBC. And at the time, I was doing a lot about user-generated content. And the BBC had all of these forums, online forums, connected to radio shows and different things. And they spent a lot of money on a consultant who went through and said, you know what? All these communities, they don't actually talk very much about the BBC. They talk about what they're cooking their husbands for dinner and like all this other stuff. So the consultant said, I think you should shut down all the forums because it's not bringing anything to the BBC, which is what they did. And I think about that all the time, because to your point, why don't we allow spaces where people can just be? I'm a massive fan of Reddit. Like, I just love spaces where people are just having a chat and there's no reason for being there. And I think I would love us to think about from a public policy perspective, what does a next door look like that's not low-level racist and about people stealing packages off your porch? Like, what does a next door look like that really is a community notice board and it really is moderated properly and it's all about bringing joy to your community? And yeah, there's going to be people moaning about dog poo and garbage. Like, I'm fine with that because that's part of community. But I do think, like, would it look like to create a public service social media community that was about, like, acknowledged loneliness, acknowledged how hard it is to make friends, and brought people together? I don't think it should be that hard. It just hasn't been prioritized because the likes of the BBC were like, what's the cost benefit analysis, right? Like the QAnon person who was like, I turned up every night and somebody said hello to me. Like, the reason that QAnon is popular is because it was puzzle based, there were clues, it was fun, and you felt something. Right? Like feeling, emotion, like it's not about facts. Our part of the information ecosystem is all about, we just need to get the right information to the right people at the right time. Nobody says, and they need to feel good when that happens, because researchers and journalists feel really icky about emotion and feelings. But that, like, as humans, we have those relationships to information. So I love your idea so much. And I think there is an appetite. Like, so I saw somebody this morning with all the chatter about the Grammys, because of course the Grammys was great last night. And it was this moment of community, nostalgia, like contemporary artists, women, like it was amazing. And so I was like, remember, Twitter used to be like this every day. before it turned into a stinking cesspool. Like, we are seeking positive spaces. So I think we could build some of them. And I think our information ecosystem needs to, because those spaces do happen, but they also exist for anti-vaxxers and stop the stealers and QAnon people.
Sure. Thank you so much.
So our next question comes from chat. So I don't know if it's Arash. Arash asks, while generative AI can be weaponized, can be also used as a positive tool. Now, he says more specifically about how it could be used for user level interventions, but maybe just we can think more generally about ways it could be used as sort of, again, a force for good as well as a force for evil. And I say in our project here and thinking about AI and disinformation, we're definitely trying to think about those risks where we have opportunities for good as well. So, yeah, what are your thoughts in this space?
Yeah, and I'm sorry if my talk seemed overly kind of worried, because AI also provides incredible opportunities. I'm in a school of public health. If we think about AI for health literacy, for example, one of my favorite things to do is to go into a New England Journal of Medicine article and say, can you make this make sense for a 10-year-old? And I get like hardcore science explained to me as a 10-year-old. You know, what does it mean to make things culturally relevant? You know, the translation abilities are really, really smart. Being able to create infographics and visuals and other things. There's all sorts of, you know, ways that I actually think we can make information more accessible. So I think your questions about correcting narratives, we know all of this. It's hard to correct somebody's belief system, but I would like to think about, you know, ways that we could build out content over time to think about counter narratives to ones that are misogynistic or, you know, racist or other things. What does it mean to think about what kind of narratives do we want to create? And, you know, AI can help us test some of those things, test messaging. You know, we can do hyper-targeted things, but I think that's why, you know, your group is so important. It's like, what's the ethics of this? Like, if we're going to think about counter narratives, when does counter narratives turn into propaganda? Like, when is it okay for us to sit around and say, we think everybody should think this about men or women or like whatever social issue we care about? It often seems simplistic until you start to say, well, how do we do this and where are the ethical guardrails? So I think the content creation piece around narratives, I think we just have to be really careful about, which is why I would love to see community involved ethical committees, advisory groups. Like, how do we ensure that voices are part of these kind of conversations? Because the power is amazing of what we could do. But I worry in the journey to say, but look at everything we can do. We know that's where missteps have happened in the past because we stop to red team and say, hang on, what are the unintended consequences there? You know, and I certainly think right now, the way that you know, content moderation has been made in parallel with censorship, it's because we didn't think about the unintended consequences of content moderation during the pandemic. And I think that's, to me, is just a very low level example of we're now in a really difficult situation because we didn't think about the unintended consequences of making decisions around speech when the science was unsettled.
Wonderful. I think our mutual friend Talia Stroud, who directs the Center for Media Engagement, will ask a question next. Talia.
Hello there, Claire. So good to see you and lovely to hear the talk today.
I was just thinking, who's got that lovely profile picture? And of course it was you.
Oh, and it's a new public one at that. So I just wanted to ask briefly, I have a feeling that we're going to see a spate of articles saying, let's run some analysis based on how much AI we detected in the social media stream that we scraped. What would make you trust that analysis more than others, knowing how challenging it is to actually detect AI?
Yeah, I mean, and also, I mean, we're hearing now the headlines from last week, which is people starting to say much more of the top Google search results are actually low-level generative AI. And so I agree with you that we're going to get those kind of analyses, but I think it goes back to, well, what kind of AI are we concerned about? And what are we okay with? Same with student papers, right? Like a student paper that's 99% generative AI, I'm not in love with. A student paper that shows me how they've used AI. And so I think that goes back to the absence of nuance in these conversations, which is, I don't think we should be like pro or con AI. We just need to have kind of some consensus is too strong, but some kind of sense of how we're going to talk about it and what kind of AI are we okay with. To that point about correcting narratives, like there could be an attempt, an intent is good, but it's actually really dangerous and unethical to have done that work. So, but I do have bigger concerns about how AI is going to eat the internet from the inside. Like the idea that when we're not allowed to scrape the New York Times and other things, what does it mean when all we're left to scrape is the low level content? But I do think if somebody said ahead of the election, 75% of pink slime websites were created by generative AI, and they had an audience that was greater than the local news sites, then I think we've got a problem. So I think it's the connection between the content analysis and audience.
Thanks, Claire.
I don't see any hands or chat, so I'll go ahead and ask another question. Claire, it was funny hearing you mention, flat Earth, which is one of those things that, most of us take for granted. But of course, there's a big community, that argues that it still is. And you probably have seen there's this wonderful documentary I saw on Netflix called Behind the Curve about these folks. And one of the interesting questions I thought raised in that was, let's take your woman with the binder, who's done all that research. Imagine the scientist she could have been at either of our universities, if she had been trained and prepared to do that, because here's somebody who has some skills. Where either did we go wrong along the way, or where could we do anything now to sort of take people who have such energy and ability to do that kind of stuff and help direct or redirect them in sort of, directions for being more constructive contributors?
Oh my God, these questions are amazing. So, well, I have always been obsessed with citizen science. And even on the topic that, Talia knows a lot about this, for the last kind of 10 years, we've all been pretty angry at the platforms that they wouldn't give us their data, right? And now we're like, oh, they're never going to give us the data. How do we work with users, not just to get their data, but to help them understand how algorithms are shaping their data? So I think to your question here, I'm a big fan of, sounds stupid, like we need to work deeply with communities. Like I'm at Brown University, you remember from your time here, we're not particularly loved by Rhode Island for good reason, because Brown University would get these big grants and then they would parachute into a community and be like, can we survey you? Can we focus group you? Bye, thanks. We'll never come back and tell you the results. And we sure as hell won't give you any of the money we just got from NIH. Right. And now Brown is, and like many universities, saying, how do we actually partner with communities to ask them what research questions they're interested in and work with them to help answer those questions to put the research back into the community? And I think information isn't always one of those disciplines that we think about working directly with the community. But I did a study a few years ago where we asked people to send screenshots of if they searched Google for vaccine information. It's like, your best friend says, should I vaccinate my child? A, what would you put into Google? And B, put it into Google and send us back your results. And what was fascinating to me was not just the data, I mean, an insane number of search queries for a start in multiple languages, but it was actually people would then send us a note being like, you know what, I've never thought about why I see certain things on Google. I mean, I was getting ads from Pfizer at the top, like that's not right. I mean, people just were doing this learning from being part of that process. So for me, when we think about the woman with the binder, I think there are a ton of people who are part of communities where they're told to do their own research. They don't have the same research methods training as me and you. So we dismiss the, like, oh, what can you bring to the table? Maybe you can send us your data as a citizen scientist, as opposed to how do you become a real partner in the research? And I mean, this wouldn't be a quick thing to change, but I do think that's one of the most important things we can do, which is work with communities. And from the AI perspective, we're about to start a ton of research with local community members to sit with them to go through what they get from different forms of AI chatbot and Alexa to say, and how do you feel about those results? Because we talk about auditing AI algorithms or output, but for accuracy, doesn't matter if it's accurate, if different communities are like, well, I'm not going to trust it. Sure, they're not going to do anything with it. So I think that, to me, is like we have to do that with communities if we're going to start building AI systems that are trusted and people take actions around. We have to bring community stakeholders to the table now, not once we've written the executive orders and like, oh yeah, communities, afterthought, which is what we've always done with all of this stuff.
Wonderful. Well, we're about at time, although Claire is kind enough to stay to talk with a couple of us later. So I'm going to try to sneak one more question in the public session before we bid some of the rest of you adieu for today. So we've been doing interviews with fact checkers from around the world. And, one thing generally we hear, the first thing they check when they're deciding what to fact check is, is it verifiable? Is there something that actually can be checked? we were surprised when we've talked with some fact checkers in India. It seems different there, that isn't necessarily the first thing they consider, and they're concerned mostly about, is it something, is likelihood to cause harm? That's their first consideration, whether it's checkable or not. And the sense is it's like a snowball, that if we don't intervene early and say something about this, it's going to become something that's going to spiral, sort of into violence. So that's the only group we've ever talked to who sort of said, my job as a fact checker is not just to look at verifiable things. You've been talking about emotive content and this sort of stuff. So I wonder, your sense of a fact checker or the fact checking community, where do we think about the role of checking stuff that's not necessarily verifiable?
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting because the Indian information context is so much more kind of a tinderbox. And many of the Indian fact checkers have a very large audience, which in many other fact-checking organizations, they're doing really important work, but they don't have massive, massive audiences. And I'd be interested to know whether from your findings you found this, but I've certainly had conversations with fact checkers that were like, yeah, sometimes we just fact check things because A, we know we're going to get money from Facebook, but B, if we have a good headline, we know that we'll also make money from Google search engine optimization. So like in US in particular, we have that actual thing. But I mean, I think this question of harm because often, and I've written some about this, there is an argument that if you move too early against a rumor, you can actually give it additional oxygen. So that tends to be the thinking kind of Western Europe and the US. So that's interesting to hear. And I think, again, because of WhatsApp, if you're seeing it on WhatsApp, it's so difficult to track. Whereas in, for example, the US, you might see something in a parenting Facebook group. And you're like, I'm just going to monitor that. I'm going to sit and watch it. Whereas on WhatsApp, you can't do it. So I think that might also be part of it in India, which is if you see it, it's like, oh my goodness, that could be spreading like wildfire. We would never know in WhatsApp. So that's really interesting. And I think might be some of the differences. But yeah, when I've spoken to fact checkers, my frustration is the way that the platforms have essentially monetized what to me should not be. To me, I've always felt like fact checking was a space in the news ecosystem that wasn't impacted by money, but then platforms have provided that context.
Yeah. Well, Claire, thank you so much for an amazing talk, and we put you on the spot with lots of questions. So I think we'll go ahead and thank you one more time and then wrap up the public portion of this talk today. Thank you so much.
And thank you for your great, I was just trying to catch up on chat, but thank you for all your great questions and comments.
Thanks everyone for being here today, also to join us.